One of my difficulties today is that I was much more articulate yesterday, and I said so many things that I'm not possibly going to be able to summarize and condense um, everything that's been expressed so far in this particular series. My intention is to try and finish the essay today. We've been looking at an essay by Roy Allen, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at University of Kent, and his contribution to this anthology from 2017 called Human Origins. We're trying to answer the question, what is it that makes humans human? And um, one of the things I noticed when I was watching the rest of this series so far was that I'm coming in with a certain framing or understanding that's not present in the text, and that is namely the awareness of the metacrisis and meaning crisis, as expressed by Schmachtenberger and Vervaeke, among other people. And when like they've expressed in other places and I've expressed in other places what that diagnosis is. Um, and so the understanding that I want to offer here is that when we trace the roots of kind of what's going wrong in the world, um, we can go all the way back to the invention of stone tools. And the reason for that is that as soon as we start seeing stone tools in pre-sapiens species, the earliest archaeological evidence of stone tools is about 3.4 million years ago, which puts it along with Homo habilis. As soon as we reach that point, then we get basically groups of humans, proto-humans, that are able to go to different environments all over planet Earth and overhunt the animals which are there. And it uh, that has the effect of basically creating an imbalance with the natural world. And so the origins of what we think of as the metacrisis started around that point in history. And we've seen throughout the series how it's this kind of a runaway dynamic between technical intelligence, the intelligence of relating with technology with tools, and the use of our hands. When this runs away with itself and becomes sort of excessively left hemispheric, to refer to Iain McGilchrist again, then that kind of intelligence, there's too much of it, basically, and it disconnects us from each other and from the world. It leads to this tendency to see things in black and white terms, in either or terms, to dichotomize. When in fact we saw that what was particularly unique about humans was this ability not only to classify our knowledge of the natural world, not only to aggregate our knowledge into categories, but also to change those categories when needed. And so if we notice this, like the thinking that comes from the left hemisphere is this is what I'm referring to with this, it's kind of technical intelligence, right? It's this either or thinking, black and white thinking, thinking in terms of that everything is um, a set of dead, inanimate objects that are there to be moved around, manipulated at will. They're merely objects, and they're basically either tools or obstacles. And that's how the world is. That's how the world looks to the left hemisphere. We can see that that is actually a story. It's one particular story because it's treating things as if they are dead objects, right? To be moved around and manipulated, when in fact they're not that way. Or when in fact they can fruitfully be interacted with from a variety of different other perspectives. So it's a funny thing to notice that way of seeing the world is in fact a story. It's using the as if analogical jump, the same way that all stories do. And the point here isn't to vilify one story or point to like, oh, um, tool making is so terrible, we should stop doing that. The point is to regain the rest of the core of what made us human as a prescription for getting through life on planet Earth in the 21st century, let's say. And I've expressed more about that in other places. What we can see from here is that the essence, let's suggest, of what made us human was not simply um, our ability to have technical reasoning, technical intelligence, and to dichotomize, to classify the natural world into different groups for the sake of simplicity and efficiency and clarity, but also to renegotiate those boundaries and do that with social intelligence, particularly with distributed cognition, with the intelligence of the collective, with the collective storage of memory, and then with symbolic cognition, which particularly involves um, the imaginal, I want to say, augmentation of the world. So this, what do I mean by that? Henry Corbin's imaginal is a way of using image and symbol, and then also story and myth as a way of getting closer to reality rather than imagination, which through fantasy takes us away from reality, right? Yeah, so we saw how our use of symbols, the evolution of our language, our ability to name things, went along with our fondness, our reliance on stories as a way of sharing our knowledge and updating it as we needed to. And that allowed for a couple of things. It allowed for the boundaries between our categories to be renegotiated when we needed that to happen. So when the environment changed or when we encountered novelty, new things, we could reclassify our knowledge, which gives kind of cultural resilience. These stories and what I was talking about in terms of archetypal memory also allows things to be simplified by being aggregated into these different categories, right? So rather than having to encounter novelty all the time, um, we can use our stories and our myths to guide us. There was one further thing, which was that our stories were deeply tied to the places that we were. We saw the relevance of 4E cognition, our um, the social nature of our intelligence and our way of being with and understanding the world was deeply culturally embedded, meaning um, the stories and the way of life that each group of people had allowed them to be who they were. Right? That's actually how they and how we experience and live in the world. Cultural embeddedment or embeddedness. Our cognition was also deeply extended throughout the natural world, right? It had to do with this knowledge of the places that we would go to and what was significant, what was meaningful about those places, when we should go to different places at different times, for example. We didn't talk much about enactment, but I think it's pretty obvious that it's we derive our knowledge of the natural world by acting in that world, right? Um, and like for example, when we go out and encounter new things, well, we have to go through the actions of going out and encountering those new things in order to learn about them. I would also say it's about ritual reenactment of that encounter with novelty, and indeed the ritual reenactment of our stories, of our archetypes, that allows us to deeply embody and experience them. And that's the fourth one, embodiment, where we saw that our language, our naming, the symbols that we use, the images that we come up with, are all ultimately derived from out of our body, and it was from out of our embodied resonance with the natural world, understanding the world from out of our own body and naming things in those terms. That was what allowed us to get into this deeply reciprocal 4E relationship with the natural world. That's a fair summary of what we've been talking about. I would say there's a particular focus here on how this kind of core of human cognition and human culture, it's just that it's at the hearth, it's at the fireplace in the middle of the human community. And we saw that there are kind of what I'm calling there's a kind of imbalance or failure condition when things get exaggerated in either direction. And what do I mean by that is um, we can go down into the many actual things and fail to aggregate our individual experiences into stories or to category structures that allow us to more simply engage with the world. Or we can only see the world through our aggregated narratives. We can only see the world through a kind of abstract category structure um, that actually detaches us from the world as it is. And so there's a way that the use of the employment, if you like, or the inhabiting of an imaginal world was an ensouled world, an animistic world, we could say. It was kind of in the middle, and it allowed these ideas that we had, these abstractions, these categories to be brought down into the body. It allowed us to feel them and experience them in terms of the renegotiation of the relationships between different archetypal characters. But it also allowed the imaginal world, and the analogical reasoning, symbolic participation, narrative, and mythic identity even, that went along with uh, the imaginal world. All that also allowed our individual experiences, individual episodes of memory to be drawn up into the collective body of our memory. It allowed the natural world in its complexity and multiplicity to be um, not just simplified, but also ensouled. So that's all fine. That should be pretty clear. What we're going to look at is the final section. And what we're exploring is when we had this runaway dynamic between our technical intelligence and the use of our hands to manipulate in a left hemispheric way, rather than to reintegrate our technical intelligence into the social body. When that happened, it kind of successively changed human life, um, human culture over a long period of time, where that runaway dynamic kind of got out of hand over a very long period of time, and then led to specific key changes, namely the agrarian revolution. So I talked about how the origins of toolmaking were about 3.4 million years ago. Well, thankfully, we had essentially the indigenous wisdom traditions around the world, which brought these right hemispheric values, which is essentially just what I've been talking about, the imaginal world and the narrative and myth and symbolic cognition that went along with it, right? But then we saw certain key technical innovations, namely the plow, irrigation, and goat herding. There were probably a few others as well that went along with a particular change in the climate into the Holocene. So there was a lot of ice ages, right? About 10 or so of them before the Holocene, and then between about 12 to 10,000 years, we get everything becomes much more stable climactically. And that went along with the innovation of these new tools that led to a radical change in people's way of life, namely farming, agriculture. And so what we're going to explore is what effect that had on our naming, on our language. We talked about how our ability to reconstitute our knowledge emerged before our language. And so it seems to me at this point that language can be drawn either way, if that makes sense. Language can be um, used in a left hemispheric way or in a right hemispheric way. And I'm going to suggest that when it's used in a left hemispheric way, then we essentially get too many subcategories for things that aren't relevant. So this proliferation of names. But we also see that the categories that we have, they seem to be dead and lifeless. They seem to lack emotional depth. Or they lack we can't access them from out of the body, right? They're quite abstract. So this is my way of talking about how the left hemisphere can sort of influence on all of those levels. That makes sense. Where if more of the right hemisphere was present, I think what we would see is there would probably be fewer names and they would be more relevant to us, or what names there were for things would be relevant names. And we would also see that our categories, our abstractions, we would be able to experience them. We'd be able to embody and sort of imaginally remember in the sense of amnesis what they were, what they are. Yeah, so I want to suggest that when we went through this steep change in our way of life that led to instead of a hunter-gatherer way of life, a more agricultural, agrarian way of life, we see this proliferation of names. And that's not exactly a problem in the sense that it's because we have many new objects, many new tools, many new phenomena to classify and coordinate. But it does become a problem if we can't experience those things um, in their numinosity, in direct experience. If we're only relating with the names of things, then we're sort of becoming detached and disconnected. So I think that's enough summary, and I'm going to move into the final section, drawing from Roy Ellen, where we're focusing on the changes that we see in our symbolic cognition, in our naming, in our language that went along with the agrarian revolution. Again, it's rather academic and it's not that long today. So it says, what constitutes a name? Conklin and Berlin showed in the 1960s that though we can treat some names as semantically unanalyzable or primary, for example, oak or cat, many names are secondary, for example, turkey oak or house sparrow, and they have obvious histories and they allude to other domains, for example, color, social domains, to certain places, to other plants and animals, or to human anatomy. Secondary names take on a kind of or part of relationship and are a feature of all known languages, a nomenclatural consequence of marking behavior. For example, A and not A, where not A is the marked term, whatever that means. So a fair way of summarizing that would simply be to say, I think that this secondary naming is ubiquitous. We see it a lot. We see it everywhere. So we'll keep going. A second paragraph. Systematic binomialism, however, is rare in the nomenclatures of hunter-gatherers compared to farmers. Binomials only become predominant with domestication, where it is necessary to firstly distinguish cultivated from non-cultivated forms, and thereafter numerous varietals. In context of proto-domestication, the basic categories that are marked are those for the cultivated form of the same natural kind found outside of cultivation. For populations where cultivation is the default mode, as among the Nuaulu, adjectival qualifiers that mark non-cultivated habitats tend to predominate. For example, forest or mountain rather than garden, village, or house. But the more humans managed their environment, the more distinctions below the species level became important. Thus, among Nuaulu plant terms, cultivar segregates, for example, sago, yams, and taro, they represent the largest group of binomials. Okay, again, it's a bit complicated. A fair way of summarizing this would be to say that the introduction of farming, it brought with it the need for many, many, many new distinctions, and they were particularly distinctions below the species level. So we were talking about classification earlier. We were saying about how um, our classifying is based on it, the relevance, right? Immediate relevances, and we sort of we saw this developmental trend where in the development of individuals and also through evolutionary history, it's the categories emerge first that are the most immediately relevant, namely at the species level. For example, we learn cat first. We don't learn CMEs and we don't learn mammal or feline. And what this is talking about is particularly the like it's talking about breeds essentially. It's like s sub-taxonomizing, like again the proliferation of names. It's talking about getting quite specific, quite atomized. And again, it's this tendency to dichotomize, to split things. This is not this, this is not this, this is not this. This is it's talking about the manyness of things. But notably, it's not just differentiating, because the whole point of naming a category, even a new category, is that it aggregates distinct phenomena. Like even if we call sago, yams, and taro, well, we can distinguish all the taro plants into one group, namely taro. So when we name things, it is doing both a differentiation and an aggregation function or integrating function. But we can see, I think, here how there's this imbalance already. There's an imbalance toward manyness, toward multiplicity, and it's also an imbalance toward abstraction. Um, there's a we have, I would say, there's less of a story, right? There's less of a story that's going along with these different terms because there come to be t too many terms so that we can't make stories about them as easily. Okay, I'm going to read. There's only one more paragraph and it's rather long, so I'm going to read about half of it. It goes, one problem with the Berlin-Achern scheme of taxonomic biocognition as a default universal model is that we have poor accounts of the ethnobiological classification of contemporary hunter-gatherers. And what we do have challenges this consensus. For example, there are fewer names reported for hunter-gatherers compared with farmers. This is counterintuitive, given claims that hunter-gatherers have more sophisticated biological knowledge systems than farmers. They also use fewer sequential naming practices. They resort less to hierarchies and ranks. They have fewer and more inclusive categories. For example, life forms. They rely more on use categories, and they're also more flexible in their categorizing. This is also the case for hunter-gatherers whom we often place in a separate category, such as the peoples of the northwest coast of America. Okay, so we've just seen this counterintuitive difference between hunter-gatherer groups and farming groups, where farming groups, like the agrarian way of life, tends towards more names, which is not necessarily what we would expect. I'm going to read the rest of the paragraph. Because these groups are subject to similar constraints, hunter-gatherers, I mean, social, demographic, and environmental, we can account for some of the characteristics through small population size and density, widespread distribution, and foraging strategies that tend to be more individual and less social, and that rely on direct experience, less easily communicated and encoded in language, not requiring lexical elaboration. Indeed, hunter-gatherer biological knowledge is more substantive than lexical, with wayfinding, for example, being less about linguistic competence and the application of self-consciously encoded knowledge than about how the body learns to move through familiar landscapes. Complex names serving as proxies for connected knowledge about specific taxa that cannot easily be expressed lexically are important once it becomes useful to encode large numbers of differences and share with large numbers of people, as in farming. Okay, again, a lot of information was presented. What it was trying to do was to show a bit more of why there might be this difference between the hunter-gatherer way of life and a farming lifestyle, where it's telling a story that the hunter-gatherer way of life relies less on relating. It doesn't need to relate complex names so much. It's less about linguistic competence and more about quote learning about how the body learns to move through familiar landscapes. It talks about wayfinding, for example. It's much more about literally navigating through the environment oneself rather than um, classifying and categorizing as much. So we see it's like a tendency toward more embodied cognition in a sense and less reliance on language. And so to me, it's already that's the end of the section. And I will go on into the summary and conclusion that follow. But what I'm wanting to point out here is that the text itself, like Roy Allen, isn't evaluating, and he's not evaluating in terms of the Metacrisis perspective or Iain McGilchrist perspective that I'm trying to also bring. But I think we can easily see here how this radical change in people's way of life led to um, consequences that have been radically exaggerated since then until now that we can see as problematic in the world today. I think we see that our abstractions going up into these aggregating into our different categories, they kind of escape us. We lose the imaginal ability to draw down our categories into embodied experience. And on the other hand, our naming of individual things or of categories also escapes us in the other direction. There become this proliferation of names that we lose the ability to draw them back up into our stories, into our embodied knowledge, right? Into the social body, into the collective memory of the group. And in both directions, both toward the abstract direction and toward the sensory direction, let's say, or toward the unification, toward the unifying, integrating direction, and toward the differentiating, multiplying direction. We see how there's this uh, tendency to use the left hemispheric way of thinking, and there's a lack, on the other hand, of this a right hemispheric way of being that is grounded in imaginal practice. It's grounded in the direct experience of both our archetypal categories, living the myths and stories that we tell, Yeah, experiencing them for ourselves. And the direct, pretty obvious implication is that we could restore that, right? And that's kind of the whole point of why it's to me so interesting and useful to explore this anthropology, is because we get a pretty clear diagnosis and description. To me, I would also say here that there's this tendency to dichotomize, to see in terms of duality or polarity. And something tells me that that goes along with the left hemisphere. But I don't know if I can justify that association at the moment. I think what I would say is that we saw how that left hemispheric way, it involves getting stuck in one particular story. And there are layers to our knowledge, right? And also to our identity, to our experience of being in the world that are beneath any one story that we have to tell. And I'm referring here to Vervaeke's like years of publishing about perspectival and participatory knowing. So when we use these symbols, these images, these mythic or archetypal categories, and the stories that we tell about them, we can take different perspectives that are deeply embedded in those stories, embedded in the places that we inhabit, and we can participate more deeply in life. And then this allows us it's a certain kind of cognitive flexibility to take up different perspectives, to see things from different points of view, I mean, to empathize with others more easily, and to embody and directly experience the categories that we make. So we can draw things up into our stories and draw our categories down into our experience. And it's imaginal practice, um, using symbolic participation in life via symbol, via story, via myth that allows for that. Okay, I'm now going to move into the summary that's offered by Roy Allen. And it's a summary of the whole chapter. And so the question that he wants to ask is like, how can we put all this together from his point of view? So he says the problem is, how can we map changes in hominin and human capacity to organize and use biological knowledge onto chronological frameworks? And what theories of cognitive and language evolution most satisfactorily support them? So what Roy Allen is hoping to do is that we can see these, like we see anatomical changes in hominin and human species over time, over chronological time, changes in our anatomy, and we're trying to correlate that, if you like, with changes in our capacity to organize and use biological knowledge, changes in our culture, essentially. Okay, he says, in terms of the first, I rely here on Schultz et al. 2012, which conveniently brings together key data, arguing for punctuated changes in hominin brain evolution at approximately 1.8 million years ago, 1 million years ago, and 100,000 years ago, plus gradual changes within Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. So these are the three kind of punctuated periods that he's going to be talking about. 1.8 million years ago, 1 million years ago, and 100,000 years ago, which are, according to him, when our brains really evolved, really changed. In terms of the second, I follow Donald, 1991, in distinguishing three major cognitive transitions. The first transition is from episodic to mimetic. I'll unpack this in a minute. The first transition is from episodic to mimetic, involving sharing and social storage. The second transition is from mimetic to mythic, meaning broadly symbolic culture. And the third transition is from external symbolic storage. And the third transition is to external symbolic storage using graphic symbols and pictures. He says this may oversimplify the picture, especially in relation to language origins, but the diversity of opinion here is considerable, and it has seemed to me wise to engage only insofar as it's necessary to explain key features of the linguistic encoding of natural history knowledge. So basically, what Roy Ellen is saying is that trying to map these changes in our anatomy to changes in the kind of culture we were using is difficult, right? And there are many different opinions. And he's trying to do it in a relatively simple way to give us essentially the gist. And so then he talks about each of these three transitions. And so rather than trying to talk more about each of the transitions that he named already, we're going to unpack them in more detail right now. So, transition one. Transition one is linked to the appearance of Homo habilis and Homo erectus with a wider geographic distribution, extending to the Trans-Caucasus and into Asia. The beginning point corresponds to the appearance of Acheulean tools in Africa from 1.76 million years ago, apparently associated with step change in encephalization, brain size. The evidence suggests an ability to hunt large animals, greater performance of social tasks, more dependent young, an extended juvenile learning phase with more opportunities for improving problem-solving capabilities, and with consequent changes in group structure, foraging behavior, and range use. This would likely correspond with a shift from episodic-like to mimetic thought between 2 and 0.5 million years ago, completed with the arrival of modern humans. This phase is associated with improved functional categorization and basic naming skills linked to proto-language. Okay, so again, there was a huge amount of information that was just presented. Basically, again, he's connecting this anatomical or biological change with this change in our culture. And he's saying that essentially we got this, again, I talked about how the origins of stone tools, I think we're about 3.4 million years ago, which go along with, like, in the time of Homo habilis. One could check if that is in fact correct, but I'm pretty sure that's right. But he's talking about a more recent evolution in our stone tool use at 1.76 million years ago. I think Homo habilis had already been around quite a lot, but it's perhaps both Homo habilis and Homo erectus spreading over a much wider area, going along with increased brain size, a new kind of tools, and all these different new abilities that we were engaged in at that time. And he thinks that that corresponds with a shift in our culture, in our thinking, namely from remembering individual episodes, episodic memory or episodic-like memory, to the emergence of mimetic thought, or what I called archetypal memory at the time. I think that was in the third episode in the series. Yeah, so it's all these changes that I just described, they went along with this improved categorization of the natural world and basic naming. So we had the first emergence of these kind of general categories, let's say, general classification from about 1.76 million years ago, apparently. Okay, transition two. Transition two is associated with Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals. after 500,000 years ago, as in since then. It was also associated with the need to adapt to a wide range of new species and environments as humans moved both within and out of Africa into Eurasia between 400,000 and 100,000 years ago. In other words, life world concepts and natural history knowledge diversified in response to habitat change and a diversity of environments. Indeed, much of what we regard as the essential features of the modern package of ethnobiological classification are probably a consequence of developments arising as humans moved into varied new environments, that they were thus able to manage with increased effectiveness through greater sharing and management of social relations, as reflected, for example, in effective fire control. The important cognitive breakthrough here, as suggested by Mithin, was a predictive model of natural history, emerging through a self-learning process in which, as the lexicon grows and sentences are used, categorization of experience leads to more complex proto-syntax. In turn, engagement between ecological diversity, local population histories, and ethnobiological classification itself fueled further cultural diversity. Okay, again, a lot of information was just presented. He's saying essentially, as soon as we started moving to a whole variety of different new environments, then a whole lot changed for us cognitively and culturally, which seems to me pretty reasonable inference. Yeah, so he calls this transition sort of mimetic to mythic thought. Um, yeah, it's a kind of, I'm not exactly sure what I would call the difference between, because I was talking about mimetic in terms of archetypal memory, and mythic seems to be a kind of extension of that. Um, I don't think we can see from here how there were, I don't think we can be certain about cognitive changes. He's talking about a predictive model of natural history emerging through a self-learning process in which, as the lexicon grows and proto-sentences are used, categorization of experience leads to more complex proto-syntax. That doesn't quite make sense to me, or it doesn't seem quite clear, really. I think I could simply suggest that it seems like there was a more complex relationship with the natural world that was emerging that went along with our with more complex language, more complex um, classification structures, and an increased ability to reweave, renegotiate what stories we were telling, what categories we were using as we went to many different places. Okay, transition three this is the last one. Transition three begins with the appearance of the first modern humans in Africa after 200,000 years ago, having evolved a fully modern life history strategy, but with no clear corresponding changes in archaeology. However, a cascade of consequences accompanied increasing evidence of symbolic behavior after 60,000 years ago. It's the Neolithic transition, as modern humans spread from Africa. Cultural variation reflected in technological specialization, art and decoration, and the rapid facilitation of full language capabilities at 50,000 years ago, involving lexical rather than phonological syntax. Syntactical language made classifying much easier by enforcing arbitrariness, for example, with category boundaries, through shared rules. It permitted relational similarity, intentionality, competences, for example, number of embedded clauses, metaphor, including totemic thinking, analogy, higher order spatial relations, transitive inference, and hierarchical and causal relations. Words could be introduced for non-basic categories as required in different eco-cultural contexts through a process of progressive aggregation and segregation, finally denoting unique beginners at a kingdom level. The adaptiveness of this system stemmed from the multiplicity of ways in which it could reorganize perceptual data, and from the redundancy built into the process. The classifications that resulted were fluid and negotiable, produced as well as reproduced. Okay. So that third transition going along with the Neolithic revolution, Neolithic transition, basically brings all the cultural variety that we see archaeologically at that point in time and connects that with these key changes in our use of language and our use of symbolic reasoning, and particularly having to do with this organization of our knowledge and the reorganization of it, as we've discussed already. And so I'm simply going to read the conclusion that Ellen offers here, and then I'll see if I have anything to say at the end. So it says, the origins of kinship and religion are big and important issues, but are not the only issues that sociocultural anthropologists are equipped to explain. I've tried in this chapter to focus more on the role of natural history knowledge in accounts of human evolution, and to pay more attention to plants in particular. In his Prehistory of the Mind, Stephen Mithen offers us a powerful model based on theories of modularity, and builds his model of natural history intelligence on the basis of the findings of Berlin and Natron. I've suggested that there are difficulties with his appeal to modularity. There are problems in defining the boundaries of modules, and a likelihood of much more continuous interconnection between the elements of different modules, such that we might wish to question the exclusiveness of separate natural history intelligence. On the other hand, the strong evidence for nature-social mutuality implies two cognitive subsystems that are constantly reinforcing each other. Similarly, what is grouped together in the Berlin-Natron model might be better envisaged as a collection of different cognitive and cultural elements that arose separately at different evolutionary phases. We need to recognize the difference between semantic domains that we can infer from patterns of linguistic and cultural practice, and neurobiological modules that we can only infer with more circumspection. Okay, well, Roy Allen is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Human Ecology, University of Kent. His main areas of current interest are ethnobiological knowledge systems, cognitive anthropology, ritual dynamics, and inter-island trade. And he conducted field research in Ireland, Southeast Asia over a period of 45 years. He has many books which are listed. He was elected to a fellowship of the British Academy in 2003 and was president of the Royal Anthropological Institute between 2007 and 11. Okay, well, thank you, Roy Allen. I found the last section a little bit more difficult to follow and didn't necessarily agree with or resonate with the simplifying transitions that were named. What I've tried to do is focus on how this anthropology is relevant to us. Which is, I mean, to me, it's very ironic that it's written in such a way that it can be like it's very abstract, right? It's very intellectual. It's quite detached from the lived experience of human beings, who I think we can clearly see are by and large lacking the imaginal practice, the facility with symbolic participation, with myth, with perspective taking, with story, and with fore cognition. We're not connected with our embedment in place and in culture. Um, or we could say that the cultural embedment that we do have is largely dysfunctional, or dysfunctional in many, many ways that we could seek to redress reasonably, and not just embedded, but we're not we don't our cognition isn't as extended into the world as it could be. It's up in this propositional tyranny in this abstract space. And so this is why I think we see this there's a clear need for the prescription, the an ecology of practices in a community of practitioners with a pedagogical program, you know, that can be grounded in a scientific worldview, but also draw from um, it's a wisdom school model, you know. Finally, I might just add that to me, I mean, I didn't talk about this much in the series. It says, again, I have to say it once per video, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And it's a symbol of an experience. And it basically refers to, it's kind of evolution of Christian symbolism, but it basically refers to this, the problem that we've actually been talking about, which is this, I would say left hemispheric derived tendency to see things in black and white either or dichotomizing terms. And it's not exactly that that's a problem, right? Because we've talked at length in this series about how useful it can be to classify and aggregate and organize and taxonomize. But when we get stuck in one particular story, then we don't have any more flexibility. We don't have we lose access to our participatory and perspectival knowing. And I think we can see from here, like if I briefly correlate, like what I'm saying is that to me, the narrative layer, the story layer, is connected with this layer of duality, this layer of dichotomizing, because it's when we tell a certain story, this is that and this is that, that like we're telling a story about not only who we are, but what things mean. And what things mean is essentially what things are going to help us and what things are going to get in the way. Um, yeah, I think we can see there how narrative connects us with a sense of purpose, but it also supplies us with a simplified model of the world that can be extremely functional. But when we don't have access to, again, telling different stories, taking different perspectives, empathizing with different perspectives, and participating more deeply in the symbolic cognition and archetypal renegotiation of relationship that is at the core of human culture, then we get stuck. And we have been stuck for a very, very long time. So to me, this anthropological research is another way of talking about what in Jung is the problem of three and four. And it's no, is there anything more? Yeah, when it talks about, and it's not mine, I mean, it comes from Maria Profetissa in the 15th century, right? But I definitely, like, this is, again, it's a symbol of an experience that was very visceral, where this became a kind of Zen koan that sort of opened up. Um, I really felt and experienced how, yeah, getting stuck in one particular story isn't going to help us, or it's a big part of what is limiting us or holding us back. And one doesn't have to rely on, like, the idea would be that by taking any different polarity, any different pair of opposites, any different story, any different dichotomy, and connecting with it, embodying it, you know, participating in it, and taking up all the different perspectives that are involved in that story. One can bring down our categories. We can bring down the abstract elements of that story into our embodied experience. And we can bring up the things of that story, the objects that we call, into animation, into reanimation, back up into life. And we can then decide what is the best kind of story to tell. We can reorganize our knowledge. We can take different perspectives that come from different stories and essentially get back in touch with life in a far more right hemispheric and animated way. So if someone only watched this video, it might not be quite clear why I tacked all that stuff on at the end. But to me, this has been a kind of guiding, if you like, a meta narrative. But the thing is, it's not just a story. It's has been and it is quite very real. All right, I'm going to continue at some point with chapter three, which is by a completely different authors from the same text. But I'm not sure if I'll do that in this series or a different series. So I'll leave it here. Thanks for coming along if you got this far. Hope you enjoyed it.